You are listening to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsor, MSP-Ignite. MSP-Ignite offers a peer group experience that is unique to managed service providers in the technology industry. If you are serious about implementing a model for success through sharing and collaboration of best practices, this is the best way to do it. Head on over to msp-ignite.com to get more information. All right, on to the show. Welcome, everybody, to this special edition of MSP 1337. This week, we are privileged to have Ryan Weeks from Datto on. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, no worries. Glad to be here.
Hey, so as a result of a question that you had posed to Steve to talk about potentially Log4j and the implications that Log4j has to all of the MSP-Ignite members and really the channel at large, I thought it was a great idea. And so before I just kind of give you free rein to tell us everything that you know about Log4j, I wanted to ask a couple specific questions. One is, can you, for our audience, give us a description of what Log4j actually is?
Yeah, sure. So when you write Java-based applications, like most programming languages, there are framework plugins or libraries or components that you can import that help you do certain things. And in the Java space, there's a couple different libraries that you can import that help you with logging. One's called Log4j. Another is a fork off of Log4j called Logback. These are the two most common kind of software components for Java-based applications for logging. And so Log4j is a perfectly legitimate software component that's designed to help with a legitimate component of what a software application needs to do, which is log.
Sure.
So where it went sideways is there's a functionality in the 2.0 beta and higher versions up to 2.16, which has a service called JNDI. It's like Java namespacing and directory something. But basically what it lets you do is it can be used to have the Java application fetch a remote Java class and load it and run it in real time.
Gotcha.
Which sounds like a horrible thing to do now that we know what we know about it, but was a seemingly valid use case at some point. Problem is, it just wasn't controlled very well, right? It didn't have really a robustness of thought. So what is happening is, and actually there was a set of researchers that found this vulnerability and disclosed this in Black Hat in 2016. But for some reason, everybody forgot about it until it just got redisclosed 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And then actively starting exploited. And the way it works is roughly the same way that shell shock worked, which is, it's a little different. Shell shock used bash would import bash scripts defined in HTTP packet headers. So your HTTP request, you have headers like user agents and
Sure,
all sorts of other things. Cookies are technically in headers. And so you could literally just set a header to have a bash script, and then the system would process that and execute the bash script. In this case, the attacker can set the attack string to anything in the URI, which is what you type in the browser, any of the headers, any of its parameters. So a lot of different portions of the web request can actually get this input put in. But it can get worse. And this is where I think people have not really thought through this vulnerability super well. Anything that causes a piece of software to process input that contains an attack string can potentially trigger the vulnerability. So think, for example, what if I named a file name, dollar squiggly JNDI colon LDAP attack string.
Mm-hmm.
And then that got stored and then processed through an entire backend application. And maybe it eventually makes its way to some, I don't know, backend vulnerable database technology that leverages Log4j. And even though that server wasn't internet facing, because the user input, the file name, got processed all the way down to the backend, your database server is now compromised.
Right.
Because it's the one that got the attack string, processed it as a valid request to go remote Java class, and then injected that malicious Java class into the JVM and ran it.
So we've basically summed up, I think, pretty clearly the geek speak, if you will, of what this is actually doing. Like if you're not in the software space, this might be, foreign territory. But what I really hear, and we've seen someone like the GitHub post, like, hey, here's a link to all of the vendors that have this potential vulnerability. It really is saying, like, if any vendor really could potentially at some point in time, whether it's in the future or in rears, have had this library in use, even if they don't have it in use today, it potentially is still sitting in their environment and potentially an opportunity for this vulnerability to be exploited unless it's patched to the latest version. So I think what is really interesting about this is, obviously we know one thing's for sure, Log4j is not going anywhere anytime soon. It's kind of an important part in the Java ecosystem.
Yes. Yeah.
Which leads to the second part of that is, when an MSP, everybody on this call, when you're having this conversation with a client, it's like, well, how come you're not already patching that? It's like, well, first off, I don't maybe even have access to that. My vendors have this in their software repository, and it's not something that we have control over per se. So how do we shape the narrative with our client prospects? Because this is way bigger than what an MSP can be responsible for fixing on their own.
Yeah, I'm gonna answer this by way of another story.
Perfect.
So in the first, I don't know, 8 hours of this being known on Friday, when it dropped, what was that? Not last week, the week before, a week ago. A lot of vendors started sending emails that say nothing to worry about. And I was scratching my head. I'm like, how do they know? Like, how do they know? Like, it feels like a bunch of tummy rubbing. Like, oh, don't worry, don't be scared. And it's like, okay, well, be a little worried and be a little scared. But like, the way I thought about it was, I am going to assess my environment for this vulnerability 100 times in the next 3 months. And this is just the first time I'm assessing it. So what I called my initial assessment. And so our initial assessment was meant to find, do we have glaringly obvious, super easy to exploit instances of this vulnerability? And it took us a while to comprehensively answer that question. It took us basically 24 hours and an all-nighter to get to that point. And then we said, okay, our initial assessment is that we have no material exposure. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean I don't have internal systems running Log4j. It means those internal systems have either been patched, had the configuration workaround applied, don't have egress network control, or are not running a vulnerable version, right? So every single one of your vendors has exposure to this. The question is whether or not they know it. And not everyone is going to know what their exposure is right away. So when your prospects ask you, what are you doing to protect me against Log4j? Your answer is, we have a continuous vulnerability management process where we assess your environment for vulnerabilities. And as the latest news comes out, we reassess your environment and we determine if additional mitigation steps need to go in place. That to me is the most reasonable answer anybody can give you, because anybody that sends you an email in the first 8 hours and says, we're not vulnerable, I would question that.
So I want to circle back, but I want to go on this small tangent because you keep using the word vulnerability. I think we all think about this from a vulnerability standpoint. Our secure outcomes advisory met on Friday, and we were talking about the town hall that we're doing in January, and it's all tied to vulnerability management. And one of the things that came up is, you have vulnerability scanning, which is always important to do. What are my vulnerabilities? How aware are we as an organization about those vulnerabilities? And then are we doing any sort of remediation to those vulnerabilities before we even get into having sort of a successful management process? And you just kind of highlighted a couple of those things, like, I'm going to do it this many times over the next X amount of days. And I think this is an area where, as MSPs, this is an area where, this is somewhat new terrain, because we're navigating with what used to be, I will catch it on the next cycle with my RMM tool, or I'm looking at the firewall and I see that there's an issue there, but I'm going to get that on my engineer's plate and I'll follow up again next month. But there's not a real management process that goes with it. And so we're constantly at the mercy of reactive remediation, like, hey, it's in the news and this is something that I need to address right now. Do I even have this vulnerability? If my tools are scanning and they don't know to scan for that, obviously that's not something I have a lot of control over. But if I already had that process in place, as soon as my vendor started adding that alerting, that notification, one would think that I now have a way to go after that and remediate. Yeah. So that's kind of what led me to thinking about sort of segueing a bit and then coming back to the tools that I know Datto has released over the last week kind of lend themselves right into that space.
Yeah.
How did you come? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll talk about vulnerability management from kind of two angles. One is the scanning angle, and the other is an inventory angle. And anybody that knows me knows, like, I'm an inventory zealot, right? Like, you cannot do information security well if you have no idea what it is that you're trying to protect. And so Log4j is a hard one. These like embedded software components can be difficult to enumerate, especially depending on like how they're packaged and how they're integrated, which can make them difficult to scan for. And so the first thing is okay, if you're going to scan, you need to know what to scan, right? So for example, one of the things we did very early was say, hey, let's go out to all of our inventory systems and let's query every single system in there to tell us if it is running a JVM process. Because what that tells you is on this box, there is something running Java. Mm-hmm. And if there's something running Java, it is a potential system that could be vulnerable, right? We did that right away. Most people are probably figuring out, how do I search the file system for a Log4j file name, right? So first right there, you need to have your inventory, because your scan's only as good as the inputs that you put into it to scan, right? So inventory is number one. You have to start from that inventory perspective. And you're lucky because everything in your environment, your customer's environment, should be in your RMMs from a systems perspective, right? Not everything, like you're not going to inventory your third-party vendors and things like that, which is a whole separate problem. But you have this really strong capability that you can leverage to do a systems assessment based off your inventory, right? And then you have the network side of the house. One of the things we saw with our own internal testing was the network tools were unreliable. And so what we found were a lot of the tools that came out in the first 48 hours would just take, the HTTP variant of the attack and inject it in the URI only. But then we found, as we were testing various different services, some services would respond to it in a header, but not in the URI. And some services wouldn't respond to it if it was HTTP, but they would if it was LDAP. And so you really needed to understand all the different ways to exploit this and how the tool worked, because otherwise the tool would give you a false sense of safety. And so what we determined was the best way for you to determine vulnerability is not for you to do a network scan, It's for you to ask the systems in your inventory whether or not they were potentially vulnerable. And then, then that answers the question, well, how do I ask them if they're vulnerable? And the answer to that was, well, it's kind of complicated.
Yeah.
But there's this really smart guy in the cyber defense space called Florian Roth, and he is just really well known, really well respected. Like if you're gonna go look for some sort of like systems based tooling for IR, you're gonna stop at his GitHub page because he's got a lot of stuff there. And he put out these mostly high quality rules called Yara rules. Yara is a common syntax that you can use to do basically like threat hunting activities. But in this instance, we're using Yara to do vulnerability hunting. We're hunting on our systems to find potential vulnerability. And so we just took the stuff that Florian did, we packaged it up in some PowerShell and made it really easy for MSPs to import into their RMMs and run. And then that gives them an inventory of potentially vulnerable systems. And that was where a lot of people were struggling, is like, well, do I get the potentially vulnerable systems from a network scan, which I may or may not be able to trust the results of, or I'm putting too much trust in, or do I go straight to the source and say, system, are you running Log4j? And we felt that the endpoint assessment tool based off of inventory information was a lot more effective than network scans. Now, I'm going to caveat even that statement. There are going to be systems in your end user environments that are not in your RMM. Anything that's an appliance. So think network switches and routers, or all of that type of stuff. So you still do need network scanning, but for the most part, your largest concern is anything that has an HTTP server exposed, right? Primarily, there's other, again, we talked about other attack vectors outside of, processing the HTTP request yourself as a web server. But basically, your inventory should be able to tell you, what are all the servers I have in my environment that are running a web server?
Right.
Okay, those are the things that I'm going to go run the network assessment tools on. And then forget about just the web servers. I'm going to ask every server if it's running Log4j. And if you did those two things, you'd have a pretty comprehensive understanding of what your end user's potential vulnerable state is at any given point in time. Now, that vulnerability state is going to change. Your users may adopt technologies with or without your knowledge that use Log4j in an ongoing basis. We've also seen in the past attackers drop legitimate vulnerable software in order to maintain persistence to an environment. So what may look like an end user installing a perfectly legitimate piece of software could actually be a threat actor leveraging their stolen credentials to maintain persistence. And so that's why I think you need to really continuously assess your environment for the presence of these vulnerabilities in an ongoing way.
So this makes me think about two parts to that. One of them is what I do as an MSP in scanning my own environment with the number of interconnections I have with my clients. And then the second one, of course, is scanning my client's environment. But along with that, I'm thinking about, a lot of MSPs in MSP-Ignite are all different levels of capability. The first thing that came to my mind before I even start scanning was, okay, well, who are the vendors that are in that, say, list that's being posted that I know I have products or services from, before I even start down the rabbit hole of taking that and going and looking at inventory? Are you seeing any like trends or patterns? Like it seems like there's a lot of vendors where it's like they have a known vulnerability. They're very quick to say that they don't have a vulnerability, yet you go and do a scan on that piece of software and you're like, huh, looks like they have a vulnerability. How come they're not, letting us all know? It's that catch-22. Like, is there one direction better than the other?
I mean, not being accurate with your assessment of your vulnerability is important, right? Which is why I didn't choose to come out and say there are 0 instances of potentially vulnerable Log4j packages at Datto, because that's not true, right?
Right.
What I said is we have no externally exploitable instances of this vulnerability. And by the time our 24 hours had gone through and we made that assessment, as we encountered every single system, we applied a workaround, or we upgraded it, or we limited network egress. We completely neutered the vulnerability. So by the time I made that statement, I knew for sure that my environment was free of easily exploitable. Because remember, we're not, right now, we're in a phase of the exploit chain where it's a land grab, right?
Yeah.
Everybody's scanning to find vulnerable instances and to try to control those instances.
So with that, 800,000 plus, threats or attacks attempted like within that first 24 hours. Are you aware, are there any known exploits that have resulted in ransomware attacks at this point in time?
I know 2 things. I haven't been able to tie it to specific companies, but there was a new variant of ransomware that
Incorporates that into
the record.
attack.
The record from Recorded Future reported a new variant that was leveraging the attack within 48 hours. And then over the weekend, the Conti ransomware group updated their playbooks for their affiliates and their exploit kits to exploit that vulnerability. So just like we saw with like the Exchange on-prem vulnerabilities, unauthenticated, give system compromised, we went through this period of mass scanning. Then we're going to go through a period of mass exploitation, which I argue we're in right now. Mm-hmm. It's just a question of whether you know it or not. And there's an interesting thing that happens in that period of time. Threat actors are actually battling for control of your asset. So they're coming in, dropping their, whatever they're dropping, and then someone else will come in, see that they're there, remove their stuff from that system. So like they're actually like competing with each other right now on these servers.
So just to clarify that for a second. So what you're saying is, if I was a threat, if I was a bad guy, my goal here is to get on your system first. If I understand correctly, you're saying that just because you're first, it doesn't mean you're the one that sticks around when it eventually comes to exploiting that system.
And the reason I'm bringing this up is, let's say in a week you find an internet-facing vulnerable instances on some server in the corner that they never told you about, wasn't RMM managed, and it's compromised, and you see it has a crypto miner on it right now. That doesn't mean the crypto miner is the only thing that's been on that system in the past 2 weeks. It could also have been part of a DDoS botnet. It could have an active ransomware threat actor in there as their main point of entry into the network. There's a number of things that you need to consider, because generally when you have a internet exposed vulnerability like this, you're not dealing with a single exploit of a single threat actor. You're probably looking at that system having been compromised by a dozen or more threat actors.
So you're making my head spin. I think you're making everybody's head spin a little bit here, because what makes me think is like I should just close my doors and go home, because that's like a lot of threats that are happening, and they're happening. Is there a rhyme or a pattern to how to approach some of these? I mean, we're going to find vulnerabilities in systems. We're going to find exploits in systems. We're going to find, we have clients that are getting ransomware, if not on a daily basis, somewhere along those lines. There's no warm fuzzy here, right? It's like, so how would you advise an MSP who is dealing with one of those situations to not freak out because you found something, but to be, proactively pushing through to remediate that situation?
Yeah. So number one, the easiest way to neutralize this vulnerability and any threat actor is, one, to limit network egress access from servers that don't need to talk to the internet. Period. right? Because again, it has to load a remote Java class, and then it has to reach out to a command and control server. Doesn't have internet access to do that, it's not going to work. Right?
Well, that raises a really important question. When you're looking at any environment, yours or your client's environment, if it doesn't need to be on in the first place, why is it on at all?
Right. I mean, my argument is every single server that gets created by you or by your customer should get it should be born in an environment that doesn't have network access to the internet. And you should open network access for the services that it needs, ideally through some sort of central proxy infrastructure or using some sort of sane approach, right? You don't want to say, oh, this thing needs to talk to Amazon. Let me open it all with Amazon, right? Okay, well, let's figure out a better approach for that, because guess what? People are hosting C2s up in Amazon's cloud, right? So you open your things up to talk to Amazon. Okay, cool. You've limited part of your attackable surface, but not all of it. So there's that. The other thing I forgot where I was really going with that, but there's kind of the egress network access. But coming back up a level, like rule number one, I mean, I call it the lost rule, right? I think his name is Jack, the spinal surgeon. He has a rule that says I can panic for 5 seconds and I have to do something, right? So when something like this happens, I allow myself the 5 seconds of panic. And then I'm like, okay, I have to do something, right? What am I going to do? And I turn that kind of nervous energy into kinetic energy towards doing something. The good news is those doing something should already be well defined.
Right.
There's a really serious vulnerability. I'm going to engage my vulnerability management process. I have a potentially compromised system. I'm going to engage my incident response process. You're just flipping switches of things you already have. Right. You don't have to. The only challenge here is understanding the new vulnerability, how it's being exploited, and applying that to your environment. So the people that really struggled with this didn't understand their environment. That's why they're having a hard time with this, because there is more than enough information, more than enough tools about, how it's being exploited, where it's being exploited from. Like 90% of all the exploits in the first 24 hours were coming from Tor nodes. Why do you allow inbound access to your customer networks from Tor exit nodes?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the fundamentals of standing up an infrastructure in any environment. And I realize that we often inherit environments and we're not being paid per se to go in and lock the entire fortress down. But that being said, when you put your tools in place and they start showing you things like, hey, this is coming from a Tor network, those types of things, we should proactively be addressing those things so that we're not having a reactive to something that could have been addressed proactively.
Yeah, I know this is scary. My message to you is, if you know yourself, you have your inventories, right? You know your battlefield, you can map out where you're potentially vulnerable, where you're not, and you know your enemy, which is how they're seeking to exploit it and what they're seeking to exploit it for. You're extremely well armed to engage your existing documented processes. This is no different than a ransomware attack. This is no different than a Trojan making its way into an end machine. There's a set of processes that you go through and respond to. The difference is you're compressing them into a really tight time frame because of the active exploitation and the urgency of the threat.
So let's segue. One of the things we wanted to talk about was that in the last week, Datto has also released 2 tools. I think it's a good transition because the reality of all of this is that we don't have to be scared, right? We have tools, we have resources, and we're not alone in this. This isn't Chris Johnson against the world to save everybody from the threat actors in one environment. It's all of us that are on this call. It's everybody that's participating in trying to make a difference against these threats. So talk to us a little bit about the tools. I mean, they came out really fast. I know they're heavily being used, and lots of people have been taking advantage of them and being very successful with finding stuff that was otherwise missed.
Yeah, for sure. So one, we didn't try to reinvent the wheel. Well, before that, on Friday, we recorded on Thursday of last week. And I think on Friday we released them. We recorded a set of videos on the tools. So those are available. I'll find a link to it and share it with you before the end. But me, Kristen Costaiola, the VP of RMM Engineering, and Stan Lee, the product manager who wrote the component, did a half-hour video on the entire tool, what it does, what it doesn't do, like really goes into depth about the tool. So I would probably, instead of rehashing all of that, I'd have you go watch that video. But the long and short of it is the tool does three things. It enumerates the system for potential vulnerable Log4j instances. It does that by walking your entire file system, creating a set of an interesting set of files, largely just the jar files that potentially could contain references to Log4j, and then uses Florian Ross tools to go through and assess whether those jar files have Log4j referenced. If it does, that'll create a detection. So that's one. It looks for potential vulnerable instances of Log4j. Two, it will look for signs of attack on your system. A sign of an attack does not mean successful exploit, right? Because I'm mass scanning every HTTP server on the internet. I don't know which ones are Java-based applications and which ones aren't. So I think I got a question from Reddit from an MSP that's like, I'm running an IIS web server and your tool said I have an attack. Am I exploited? And I'm like, don't know, dude. Does the application on the web server run Log4j? If it does, yes. If it doesn't, probably not. Like, you need to know more, right? So you can take that initial list of all the servers that have Log4j instances in the jar files and marry that with the list of systems that have potential attack detections. Create that set. You have a risk-based prioritized set of servers to assess for vulnerability and for potential exploitation, right? And then the third thing the tool does is it lets you set the, there's a config string that you set to true, which inoculates the vulnerability. One caveat that has come out since the tool on Friday, if you're running Log4j version 2.15, setting that string is not enough. There's another message lookups configuration flag that needed to be set to true. So my general consensus is if you're on 2.15, just upgrade your system to 2.17 and you should be fine. So 2.15 is the only version where the inoculation doesn't work, but we will go through and set that flag, which means the next time the system, and we set it in a way that's persistent. So when the system restarts, it'll pick up that flag. Now, some applications need to be restarted to pick that configuration up. So again, this is where like, I'm not going to create a script that goes all chaos monkey on you and starts restarting all your services, but like it can go through your entire environment and set that config flag. And that way, you know, as services crash and come back up, at least they'll come back up in an invulnerable state.
Right. I mean, we can always exploit something if we try hard enough, right? Like if we put enough resources in it. So a couple of questions that came up. One of them is tied to an MSP that's taking advantage of the tool. And the question that got asked was, should we go a step further than that and be looking at creating our own tools, or does it matter? Like, you know, the reality is, you know, MSPs are already strapped for time and resources. If there are tools available, do we really need to go down the path of developing our own?
Yeah, I think that's good to have, but I don't want to.
I mean, it's a great question. Like, I can point out for you a half a dozen caveats with like the tools that we packaged. Like, one, the rules that Florian wrote only look for the common attack strings. Those were the ones that we were largely seeing, and you know, 90% of the attack strings we continue to see on a day-to-day basis. But there are evasion strings that have been created that won't pattern match as well. So even our attempts to use those rules to scrape those log files will potentially miss some targeted attacks using specific evasion strings.
Sure.
So one of the reasons we continue to have the tool reach out to Flory and download the latest Yara rules is because we expected that as that evolution occurred, he would update his rules, and we didn't want you to be using static versions of outdated rules, right? So that's one caveat. The other caveat is there's some disagreement about whether or not scanning jar files alone is enough. There's also WAR files and EAR files, and this tool only scans jar files. So the question isn't, should you make your own tool? It's what's the right set of tools to help you process and understand your vulnerability.
Well, more importantly, if I understand what my inventory is, I can make better decisions around what tools I need to use in that process.
Right. Because if you don't know what your inventory is and you're just throwing tools at your environment,
you're probably going to break something.
Yeah, you're creating chaos, and you're creating an inordinate amount of work for yourself, right? These tools are meant to help you zero in on where you have the most potential exposure. If the tool is creating more work for you,
right,
it's the wrong tool.
So that brings up a really good point. So I've spent, I don't know, the better part of this last year talking about people and process and, working together, and largely tools should be like the last thing you're looking at. And when you are looking at tools, what's the two questions that you're asking yourself? Like, A, is this solving a problem that I know I have? Or B, is this to address something that I've been exposed to that I didn't understand fully? So say like the Log4j. But I spend a lot of time saying, no to tools. And I was getting ready to start a series on why you need tools. And the reality is, if I can reduce my resource consumption on people because it's automating some of that detection process and solving problems, awesome, great. To the question that was asked as to whether or not they should and shouldn't develop their own tools, I don't know. If you got the bandwidth and the resources to do it, maybe you should. But it goes back to what you said. Do you understand the environment? Do you have your handle on the inventory? Because you might be an exception, right? Like where you need a detector that's different than the one you're getting from Datto or somebody else. Maybe.
Yeah, I would say that the likelihood that you're a snowflake here is pretty rare.
Hey, we're all snowflakes.
You're in this one, we're all raindrops.
Okay. Right? Okay. We're all walking on raindrops. I like it. I don't want to, I know we've got about 20 minutes left that was allocated for this time. So I think at this point, Steve, I think we should make sure that if there are any additional questions that we get it opened up for those. Weiss, I know you've probably been wanting to get a question out there, so go ahead and ask.
I wanted to continue this discussion on the tools because I'm looking at a bigger issue of insurance companies eventually wanting you to show them proof that you're doing proper vulnerability management, right? I mean, if you think about it, we've been doing vulnerability management for a while just with Windows patching, right? A lot of MSPs at least do Windows patching. That's kind of what this is, but taking it to the next level across all the products that your clients use. And if you don't have a way to show them that you're not only identifying and managing, determining how you're going to remediate or when you're going to remediate, and show them that you're actively doing that, it's going to be hard to prove due diligence that you're really looking out for your clients. And there might be some extra shared risks there depending on your agreement with the client and what you're actually doing for them. So when this happened, and to Ryan's point, it's so widespread. I posted on there, it's even on Mars. I don't know if you guys knew that yet, but there's a copter on Mars that has it, right? This is outside of the world, out of this world vulnerability. I immediately signed up for like a vulnerability management tool, regardless of which one you're using. I needed to have my eyes on everything. And then I needed to be able to use a tool to be able to say, okay, found this vulnerability. This is how we're going to remediate it. We remediate it and then we run the tool again, right? And then it shows it's remediated. So now I can show a timeline of events that we're actually managing vulnerabilities for our clients. And that's harder to do when you're using a disparate set of tools. That's not to say you wouldn't use Datto RMM to remediate, because we use the hell out of that. but we didn't use, we don't ultimately want that to be our only tool that's telling us we have vulnerabilities. We need something that we're going to manage all of them in collectively, so we can produce these nice monthly reports saying, hey, here's your vulnerabilities we addressed this past month. Here's the ones that are still open that haven't been addressed, right? So I wanted to throw that out there to get a lot of MSPs realizing and thinking about that. We've already been doing this with patch management windows. It's taken it to the next level, and it's performing due diligence so you can prove that you're managing, right?
Yeah. I think there's kind of gets me on a tangent or a tirade a little bit on like vulnerability scanning does not equal continuous vulnerability management.
Right.
And yes, you do need scanners. Like we just released a tool that helps you scan, right? But the vulnerability management process is a lot more than just the scanning, right? Because it's really about people.
It's about accountability,
process, right? It's a capability that requires a tool to help you make the most informed decisions you can about which vulnerabilities to address in which order. Because in reality, there's always going to be more vulnerabilities than you can, like, you'll never get that number to zero.
And we're not risk experts. So why try to be a risk expert when you can use and leverage tools that help us identify known risks and vulnerabilities, to your point, and make, decisions around how to remediate those?
Yeah. But again, there's simple stuff that help you do risk-based vulnerability prioritization, right? Is there an active exploit? Is the vulnerability present on a service that is internet facing, right? Those two things are what we used here in Log4j to do a risk-based assessment of presence of vulnerability. Those two things should be used continuously. Anytime you have an exploitable internet-facing vulnerability, that's a must fix within 24 hours type of issue. I don't know how many MSPs have processes around their scanners that will alert them if they have a potentially internet-facing exploitable vulnerability to kick off a remediation process. The other thing too is, like, this one was really interesting for us. We actually, I hit my teams on I was a Catholic school teacher. I hit them on the hand about an hour into the response because people were responding, but they were like, this is a vulnerability response. No, this is an incident response. And I'm like, it's both.
Right.
It is both a vulnerability that we need to understand that is actively being exploited. Declare an incident and declare a vulnerability response. Do both things.
Right. There's no downside.
Yeah. Right. So like we were running these processes disjointly, and I was like, declare them both officially and get everyone together. And so, like, one of the things we took away from this is, man, we need to have a much better process for these kind of nuanced big things, because, like, this person over here was waiting for that person to declare a problem, and that person's like, after a half hour of this, I was like, both of you declare and let's go. Right. So, there's stuff you learn when you do this. It's never clean. Even the best documented vulnerability management processes had problems with this. And this is where you respond, you monitor for new information, and you go back and you figure out, how do I need to improve my process? Do I need to have better access to people? Like, I don't know. I know some companies that didn't declare the response an incident until Saturday afternoon when a bunch of their employees were at holiday parties.
Right.
Right.
So
there's a lot of things to work through here.
So Ryan, throughout this entire conversation, Log4j being sort of the focus, is that I'm hearing interwoven into this is that you need to have an incident response plan that's fleshed out. You need to have a handle on your inventory, and you need to be doing incident response and have a process for that as well. Yeah. I think that in a nutshell here is Log4j is the first to be on this level, get this fast of exposure, and we need to do something, whether it's been ransomware or someone's actually been compromised. This is the first of what I believe will be many, right? Like, this is, if this is vulnerable, what else is vulnerable? So,
Yeah,
you know,
I mean, we've seen this in the past, right? Heartbleed, shell shock, this one, they're all
WannaCry,
the
yeah.
same thing, right?
Yeah.
It's just another form of a supply chain compromise. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to, you know, given the rise of the supply chain compromise, you're going to see a lot more of these software components starting to get looked at by threat actors for vulnerabilities. And that's going to lead to a rise in these types of urgent vulnerability responses. So, you know, get through this one, but take this as an opportunity to get your processes really shored up.
A real tabletop exercise, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this too. Anytime you have to respond to something, it doesn't just have to be an incident, right? Whether it's an outage, whether it's a vulnerability, those are all opportunities for tabletops. So
I wanted to switch gears. We're starting to run out of time. Steve has been patiently waiting. He has had a question. I think it would be best coming from him to ask it, because if I paraphrase what he put in notes, I'll screw this up.
No, and I'll say it totally different than what I typed to you anyway, Chris. So
exactly.
Thanks.
You bet.
You know, Ryan, as I'm listening to you go over all of this, and obviously most of you guys know I'm the least technical person on this call, right? I run the peer groups and used to pretend to run an MSP or a couple of them. And I think about this and I say, there are underwriters working for the insurance companies that have already written this new question that you guys are going to see soon. And it says, do any of your applications use Log4j? Yes or no? That's going to be the question. Yes or no, right? If you put yes, you're turned down from this cybersecurity coverage, right? And I think it behooves all of you to make sure that you've got the full incident response plan. You've got the full description of what you're doing to test for vulnerabilities on a regular basis down, so that you're delivering your plan, not just answering these yes/no questions that are going to come from the carriers. Because guess what your customers are going to say? Well, you're not doing enough. My insurance company says so.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious what you guys think on that side. You know, the whole business side of this comes into play a little differently. Ryan's sharing stuff related to this already. I know, I see it.
is that a question for me?
It's for anybody, really, Ryan. I mean, it could be for you, Chris, certainly. I think it does go towards more the secure outcome side than it does.
I will rephrase the question. I will rephrase the question to Ryan, so we make it a Ryan question. Because here's my short answer: is I'd also asked what's the appropriate answer from an MSP perspective. What is the right answer versus what is the answer that the insurance company is looking for, right? So I think that if an insurance company is asking me specifically, are we managing or taking care of systems that run Log4j? And I don't see them in my inventory, then the answer is no. If that doesn't mean that tomorrow those can't get added into that inventory, but as of right now, I would say no. Now, if that comes up, I would want to make sure that I'm going back and saying something to my insurance broker like, hey, this is new. I have found this. It creates that transparency with the person that's allegedly going to help me. Now, when I flip this to the security side of this question, if that question's being asked and I don't know the answer, that's a whole different problem. I'm not even sure I can turn this into a security question. Ryan, I'm sorry.
I mean, I guess one thing I'll say is I could be slightly contrarian here. I don't think carriers are going to ask you if you have Log4j. I think they're going to ask you to see your documented vulnerability management and response process.
Let's hope so.
I would hope that's the case, Ryan, but there was a time over the summer when we already saw a carrier or two ask a question about, do you use any products by X, owned by X, right? One of your competitors, Ryan. And that was the simple question. It's an unfair question, right? I mean, it's okay for Datto's business in this case, but it was an unfair question, really. And that's why I say that I think they will pop up.
Yeah, I mean, I it's tough to argue with the insurers and the underwriters, but
yep.
I would definitely reframe that to, you know, one of my favorite tactics of those questionnaires is to not provide a yes or no, but to provide a written response which says, we have a comprehensive vulnerability management, documented comprehensive response and management program around vulnerabilities.
That's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, which includes addressing urgent security threats like Log4j, but also the millions of other vulnerabilities that exist in the world. And kind of throw that on, because like, but if you don't have that, obviously don't write that, because then that's a fraudulent statement and you'll get yourself in trouble. But
well, I go back to the inventory question earlier, right? I mean, how many people, I don't want to show hands on this one because I have an idea, but a large percentage of the MSPs out there do not have a full inventory of everything they support at every client. Let's be fair. They like to say they do. I could pull it from my RMM or this or that, but they don't have a true inventory, and therein lies the problem right away.
Well, now that we've made this an insurance conversation, I think what's really interesting is that these questions aren't given to you in a way that says, please write in free form essay style your answers to this question. It is literally a yes, no. And if you say yes, then the follow-up question is it X, Y, and Z? And you're like, wait, how do they already predictively know that that would be the next series of questioning?
Right. Chris, I know you had Brian with his hand up before.
Yeah, so go ahead, Brian.
So another thing that I've kind of come to realize, and I guess I'm asking for Ryan's input on this, is like the vulnerabilities we know about are the only ones that have been found so far, right? I mean, if you've got a router running, 6-year-old firmware, and it's because they don't have a newer version of firmware out for it, does it not have vulnerabilities, or is it just that they haven't been found yet, right? And so I also question like legacy tech, even if there hasn't been an update to fix a vulnerability, does it still potentially have one that might be found one day?
You're in the kind of, I don't know, you're in the unknown unknowns problem.
Yeah.
My problem is most MSPs aren't even in the known knowns problem, right? And like what this vulnerability questioned is the people that thought they had a good idea of known knowns started to question, do I have unknown knowns? Right? Do I have unknown exposures to a known vulnerability? Right? Vulnerability management is very easy when you can quickly answer, do I have known exposures to a known vulnerability?
And there was a question that just came in for that, Ryan, that was talking about the recent cyber power panel that's basically installed on, more or less every PC. And, that question is, it's only a matter of time before this exists across, everywhere, not everywhere, but like in so many more places. How do you respond at that point? Because we're literally at the surface of this with Log4j. Java is so widely used. Tomorrow it might be like, hey, we missed these 1,000 vendors that we now have covered. Everybody's using at least one of them.
I think at this point, the likelihood that vendor technology is not well understood. Let me rephrase this. By now, every vendor knows or doesn't know if they're vulnerable.
Sure.
If they don't, they are completely negligent and you should fire them.
Is this the known unknown? Is this the known unknown?
Well, this is the challenge is how to make it known.
Right.
How do I know which vendors have known vulnerabilities? And so I'll give you my example. Literally 10 a.m. rolled around, we declared it an incident, and my incident response process says, if it's a vulnerability, engage the third-party risk team. Called up my third-party risk guy and I said, hey, new vulnerability, here's the information, go read about it. Figure out every single vendor we use that has potential exposure and reach out to them to tell us whether or not they're vulnerable. By Monday morning, we'd reached out to over 100 vendors. We had 2 responses.
Well, this gets into like third-party vendor.
Yeah, this is not simple, which is why part of the reason we created the script was the only system of truth is your file system on your server. That's the only place that is going to be able to tell you whether or not you have an exposure.
Because that's the
Everything
evidence.
else, lists of vendors, and they're all subject to human error and conjecture and misreporting or misreading, or the only thing that's going to tell you for sure is the assessment of your environment.
Well, this goes back to knowing who your vendors are, right? So you may have a scenario where, like you said, an end user's installed a piece of software that's not in your inventory list. It's not even on the list of vendors you would even have looked to see, and you didn't recognize that one because it's not one that you're familiar with, and now it's there. So as long as we're continuously scanning, this comes back to, hey, who put XYZ product in that environment? And now you're having a second conversation, right? Like this goes back to why we talk about zero trust and trust plus and all these different ways of saying, no, you can't install any more things because one of those things might be that one thing.
Okay. I just put a list of the 5 inventories that we used in our response for this. Who are our vendors? Look at the most critical ones first. And we use a platform to monitor the technologies and the state of the security of those technologies and use of our vendors.
Awesome.
And we queried that technology to say, are there signs of the vendor's use of Java in their infrastructure? And if the result was yes, they got a questionnaire. Then we looked at our source composition analysis tool, which tells us for the software we write, what are all the components that get imported and what is the status of those components? And so that created a hit list for us for every product to go through and assess. Application inventory, which is what are all of our web applications that may be in addition to what's in the source composition analysis. And let's assess those with scanning tools. Mm-hmm. Let's use our system inventory to query each system to determine if it's running a JVM. And then let's look at our software inventory to determine, as lists of vulnerable vendors come out, do we have any known instances of that software running in our environment? That's how we leveraged inventories in our response. Can you imagine doing this if you didn't have those?
Can you imagine a small MSP that just was able to regurgitate what you just said about their own environment? No, I'm just kidding. This is Ryan. I want to say thank you from everybody at MSP-Ignite Secure Outcomes for reaching out. This has been hugely valuable. I think everybody that's on right now is at least going, I have an action item list to go out and do as soon as we get off this special episode. And I want to thank everybody that it's attending. Hopefully you'll go out and listen to this again, because I think the second time around is where we go, oh yeah, I forgot that piece and I really need to put that into my documentation. So Ryan, again, I want to say thank you. Thanks to everybody that's on. Everybody have a great week.
Yeah. Happy holidays.
You too.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Chris. Take care, everybody. Have a good holiday.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks.